Welcome to the first chapter, the first unit of the first chapter of the People's Academy. This unit is called The Rebellion is Brought to the North, Internationalism and National Liberation, and it seeks to help make sense of not only the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the various forms of resistance that it has engendered, the various forms of solidarity that have emerged in response to it, but also more broadly, the history of anti-colonial struggle and its relationship with capitalism. Now, capitalism has from the very beginning depended on the colonial arrangement and on the imperial arrangement as a way of providing it with cheap labor, with cheap land, and with cheap resources. The imperial arrangement, as we'll study in the course of this chapter, has also made it possible for the ruling classes in capitalist societies to secure a degree of consent from their working classes for imperialism, for imperialist exploitation abroad, which is one reason why, contrary to what some might have anticipated at the start of the 20th century, the revolution did not begin in the advanced capitalist societies, but in fact, the greatest revolutionary potential emerged in the colonized world, in the world that fed the capitalist systems with resources and labor and land. In this introductory unit, we're going to look at both the concepts that give birth to capitalist exploitation in the colonies, but also the theories of internationalism that emerged in response to that, the theories of internationalism that came to see the need to organize and build coalitions of anti-colonial forces precisely as a way of severing the arteries that fed capitalism in the colonial metropoles. And here to help me introduce this unit is Bikrum Gill, a member of the Faculty in Political Sciences at Virginia Tech, and the author of Political Ecology of Colonial Capitalism, Race, Nature, and Accumulation. Bikrum will introduce the subject matter of the course. We'll go through the material that was covered in the readings, and then hopefully towards the end, we will also have time to go through some questions that were raised in the Telegram group and elsewhere. So with that, I will pass it to Bikrum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I just couldn't unmute myself there. Just give me 1 second here. Okay, thank you. Oh, I just lost my notes. There they are. All right, thanks, Powell, for the introduction there, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So yeah, as Powell was mentioning in the introductory comments, the theme for today is internationalism and national liberation. Again, thinking about this question of why the revolution starts from the peripheries. We have readings by Karl Marx on primitive accumulation and one on the modern theory of colonization, which is interesting because I think the tradition of third world Marxism that we're going to be looking at throughout the course is one that I think people like Samir Amin, they'll look at Marx's method on primitive accumulation, but they'll try to exceed the content because as we'll see, Marx still does remain contained within somewhat of a Eurocentric understanding of the significance of primitive accumulation in the colonies. So we'll try to work through that. But the question that I want people to really think about is the one that was just raised, is why historically has it been the case that revolutionary movements and revolutionary potential has really taken hold in the peripheries of the capitalist world system. So that's going to really, I know we're going to come to it later in the course, it's really going to emphasize this question of how we understand that imperialism is the bedrock of the capitalist world system. It is the primary contradiction that bears upon all other contradictions, right? So we're going to try to understand what that means and the significance of this, right? So, some of these debates, we have a reading by Che, or a recommended reading by Che, and a message to the Tricontinental, right, where he goes into some detail on the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, which obviously goes into the 1970s, which has a lot of, I think, lessons for us today, and maybe we can read some of that together for the situation in Gaza and West Asia, and how this relates to the capitalist world system more broadly, right? So now to understand why, to understand why the revolution starts from the peripheries and why this question of anti-imperialism is the primary question, we need to understand the structure of capitalist imperialism and the relationship between capitalism and imperialism. And I think to do so, this is where this concept of primitive accumulation is going to be very important for us. So I'm going to spend some time. I want us to think about be able to have a grasp of primitive accumulation, but especially thinking about primitive accumulation in a global register. So what does that mean? This is something that was introduced by somebody by the name of Sam Moyo, who we're not reading today, but who's a very significant, I think, figure in the theories of national liberation today, of third world Marxism today. This notion of global primitive accumulation, thinking about how it transpires on a global scale beyond just Western Europe, in terms of thinking about the origins of capitalism. So primitive accumulation, what is this? How does it relate to colonialism? How does primitive accumulation in the colonial register help us understand the relationship between, say, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism? Now, another key concept I will discuss is something that comes up in the Enroll reading, is the agrarian question. So we'll come to the agrarian question, and this is really going to emphasize for us that in the question of national liberation, right, the question of anti-imperialism from the peripheries, the role this plays, that the agrarian question is fundamental to understanding the question of national liberation. And related to this, we'll think about sovereignty, right? Like what is the place of sovereignty, the denial of sovereignty, and the reclamation of sovereignty to both the establishment of the capitalist world system and its potential transcendence and overturning towards a different type of international order. Whether we want to think about that in terms of a movement towards socialist and communist orders, or more broadly, just a world system in which the peripheries have regained their sovereign capacity to reorient their labor and resources towards sovereign national development, and why that is significant. Okay, so I will move through that somewhat systematically, but just wanted to begin. We'll begin with Marx. Okay, the readings there, I think the assigned chapters were 26 and 33. I think another chapter that is useful here is the genesis of the industrial capitalist, but we'll just begin there. So let me first begin, though. I want to begin just with a brief discussion of, well, what is capitalism, and then we'll work towards how this relates to imperialism, right? And then I'll come to this through Marx. So when we think about capitalism, of course, I'm sure many on the call today or listening in would be familiar that some of the definitive features of capitalism, of course, it's a system in which the means of production are owned privately by a capitalist class, right? That is exploiting a dispossessed working class. So there's a laboring class, a capitalist class. The capitalist class holds political power. And these are another key component here is these are really market-dependent actors, right? The capitalist class and the laboring class are market-dependent, and therefore there's intense competition that structures the activity of these actors as well, right? So capitalists compete with one another, and they do so by exploiting the dispossessed working class who has no other way of realizing the reproduction of its life besides selling its labor power to the capitalist class. So this is a very exploitative, yet at the same time, very productive system that enhances and generates surpluses, which is claimed to benefit all of humanity ultimately, because maybe it can lead to socialism, but it exceeds the preceding feudal system in its potentials, right? Like, because now it gives, let's say, all of humanity a surplus, which can enable, say, more people to move from the drudgery of agricultural work or labor-intensive work towards industrial work and post-industrial work eventually, right? So this is maybe one understanding we can begin with of capitalism. Now, Marx in this chapter on primitive accumulation, and it's interesting. One thing to keep in mind is Marx. This is the end of Capital Volume 1, right? So Marx is kind of ending his study of capitalism in this volume at the beginning. So he's kind of taking us here to now, what is the structuring basis of the capitalist system? How does it emerge? How does this capitalist class that owns the means of production and a laboring class that is dispossessed, how does this come to be historically? And why is that so significant to our understanding of capitalism? So before Marx gets into a discussion of what he understands primitive accumulation to be, he offers us he begins with a critique of classical political economy, right? And I think this is important for us to understand and begin with, right? And so he's engaging with somebody like Adam Smith and other classical political economists who, as they're critiquing mercantilism and thinking about capitalism as an advance of pre-existing economic systems, whether feudalism, mercantilism, or whatnot, they argue that, well, this system in which some own the means of production, others are dispossessed, this is a very just system. It's a very just distribution of capabilities, right? What Marx is saying is that they argue that over centuries or over a long period of time, those who were able to most efficiently use resources, most productively use them, they just over time ended up being the owners, right? And those who were lazy or inefficient or unable to rationally manage resources over time ended up with nothing, right? So this is how you understand why you have such a large dispossessed working class and a minority of owners. Well, they are the ones who should own because they have proven over time to be the rational managers of society's resources. And so you would want them to manage the production process, whereas the working classes, they don't have those capacities. So their natural capabilities in the market is to operate as workers, right? And so then capitalism is a way in which, although it's unequal, right, it is the most efficient and productive way of organizing society's resources and labor, right? So now Marx, he refuses this premise, right? And he does so through a very deep study of what historically is referred to as enclosures, which ties to this concept of primitive accumulation, right? So now, by primitive accumulation, whether Smith or Marx, what they're thinking about is, again, maybe I should have mentioned this before the discussion on classical political economy, but how does this system come into being? How does it historically emerge, right? Like, so if you have a capitalist class that holds a surplus and they're looking to reinvest this surplus and generate more profits and accumulation out of this, well, how did they come to hold this surplus in the first place? And so, again, we just went over the classical political economy explanation of this. Well, for Marx, this is not an outcome of a just distribution of capabilities, right? This is an outcome of force and violence, right? Now, that's a very, very important qualification that actually, in some ways, should ask us to question the very basis of capitalist rationality, right? The very basis of how rational capitalism is as a system. Now, why is that the case? Because, so Marx will argue, it wasn't the case that, again, over time, you have this slow process through which those who are most rational and productive end up owning, and those who are not end up being dispossessed. It's a process through which, and I can't, we don't have time to get into the details of this. Marx does get into the details of this in that chapter that follows the one you were assigned. There's the I think it's the expropriation of the agricultural population in England. He's looking at this, right? So basically, through violence, though, and through force, you would have had a large amount of people lose access to common lands or ways of accessing land and resources independently of the market, right? That they could reproduce their lives outside of the market. So they become kind of free laborers in the sense that they no longer have any direct access to the means of production, right? Now, this happens, again, the point is through force and violence, that the capitalist class ends up becoming the exclusive ownership class. And this provisions, Marx argues, this is where the original quantum of capital comes from, right? It doesn't come from a competitive market process that generates a surplus in the hands of capitalist owners. It's generated through force and violence. Now, what that should ask us, in one sense, is that it does suggest, well, how rational is this? If those who own the means of production came to own it through force and not through necessarily outcompeting others in the market, right? So that means the very foundations of capitalism has an irrational core to it, right? Because you can say, well, if there is a promise of market competition, the promise is that it can sort out what is the best and most efficient and productive way of producing goods, right? But if the foundation of this is a force that delivers resources into the hands of people, not on the basis of their ability to produce, but just on the fact that they possess more military force or in some means, is kind of where Marx starts this question of primitive accumulation, right? So it's a way of accumulating through force, and not through market competition, not through innovation or other means, right? Now, so it doesn't, just one other point here is primitive accumulation doesn't just generate a quantum of capital for Marx, though. It is a moment in this chapter where what he's discussing is capital is not simply a stock, right? It's not that primitive accumulation is a process through which those who are enclosing land in Western Europe come to possess a stock of capital. It also is the process through which the very social relations of capitalism are generated and born, right? There's a qualitative component to primitive accumulation. So primitive accumulation is the process through which labor and capital come into being, right? They are born through these enclosures. So land is enclosed, this dispossesses a class, they become a laboring class, and another class emerges as a capitalist class, right? So now capital is a social relation between these two, right? So this is in the second chapter you would have been assigned on the modern theory of colonization. Marx is basically arguing that even if you had a capitalist class that had a monopoly over the means of production, there's no way for them to realize surplus and profit without a dispossessed laboring class that they can put to work on the means of production, right? So this is I think one key component of primitive accumulation. It generates both a quantum, a stock of surplus capital that then is the basis for investing and reinvesting into industry, into production, but it also generates the social relations of capitalism, right? A dispossessed class that has no means of reproducing itself without going onto the market and selling its labor to the capitalist class, which then has the leverage and the power with which to exploit that class, right? So there's a distinct qualitative component, these beings that come into existence. And another emphasis here is then they become very market dependent, right? So however much even Marx is saying is however much then this is a very unjust and exploitative foundation, it can eventually emerge then into something very productive because the way these new beings, the capitalist and the worker, because of their market dependence, are they are driven towards a very productive logic, right? Through competition. Now, there is a way in which this will eventually, or this structuring basis of capitalism, the capital-labor relation, which is a contradiction, it leads to very severe contradictions, which will bring into question the ability of the system to accumulate endlessly, right? So if I can just say a word on that before I think moving on to maybe a limit of Marx on this question of Marx, but especially, let's say, the tradition of Western Marxism, right? Powell, did you want to, should I continue going on, or did you want to, I know you were saying.
No, please continue, please. This is great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no, I know you're saying on primitive accumulation, you may have had a question. Okay, so this structuring basis of capitalism, right? A dispossessed working class encountering an ownership class. It generates contradictions within itself in the sense that the objective of the capitalist class is to, let's say, put to work this laboring class to produce goods, right? Let's say textiles or whatever else, and to generate profits out of this exploitation. But the problem is the logic of the capitalist class is to drive down the wages of the working classes. But they're generating a product, right? But then there's a contradiction here because how will you generate value out of that product? You need a market to which to sell that product, right? But if the mass of society is a dispossessed working class, there's going to be a contradiction here between the realization of profits and the suppression of wages, right? Because you will limit the market through which you can realize profits because now you're driving down the wages of the workers. But if the workers are to possess the wages through which they can become a consuming class and realize the value of capitalist production, well, the increase in wages will eat into profits, right? So there's a contradiction there. That will then eat into the profits that are the very motivation of capitalist production in the first place, right? So, and I think this is something that the recent book by the Patnaiks, I think Capital, well, the recent one they wrote on capital and imperialism, I think in 2021, they get into this in quite a bit of detail. But I think for us, for now, an important point to note is that primitive accumulation generates a stock of capital. It generates social relations, capital labor, which are inherently contradictory, right? There's a contradiction between simultaneously exploiting the laboring class and reproducing the laboring class as a class that can also be a consuming class, right? Through which the capitalist class can realize profits, right? So how do you generate value from production? You've exploited the workers, but now you need to sell your products and repress their wages. So this is, I think, an important point to just keep in mind, because the tradition of Western Marxism will say, okay, so you have the origins of capitalism in the enclosures in Europe, right, in primitive accumulation in Europe. This generates contradictions, which might then need to be resolved through colonialism and imperialism, right? So, but if we frame it this way, colonialism and imperialism become secondary contradictions. They become secondary moments to resolving the ultimately primary contradiction of capital and labor, right? And I think this is the work of people like Robert Brenner and the tradition of political Marxism in the 20th century, right? And a lot of these debates would have really become quite intense in the 1970s during the period of where the article we're reading by Che comes up. Like, is the Vietnam War at the forefront? The resistance in Vietnam, is this at the forefront of the struggle against capitalist imperialism? Or is it very secondary, right? And these were a lot of debates that emerged in the 70s between, say, world systems analysts and, say, Western Marxist thinkers like Robert Brenner, right? Who really actually argued that what the South and the peripheries need is they need to replicate the capitalist development path of the North, right? Like that they are actually underdeveloped, or they are developing, to draw off of Rodney, who we read today as well, who draws this distinction between underdevelopment and developing, that they are less developed than the North because they haven't had these revolutionary transformations that led to capitalist social relations in the North, right? So that's I think just a key point to keep in mind. The Western Marxist tradition will say primitive accumulation happens in Western Europe. It may generate contradictions, it may be exploitative, but it generates enhancements in productivity, right? Some of these contradictions may be, for example, that you generate an overproduction in goods, an overaccumulation of capital, that you cannot realize a place to reinvest or a sale for those products, which generates the need for colonial markets, right? That's a secondary question, though, because it arises out of the contradictions in the core. Now, there's another moment in Marx, though, that Western Marxism systematically has ignored, right? This is the moment in Marx that, of course, I think it's in the chapter on the genesis of the industrial capitalist, where Marx actually references when he says capitalism is born in blood and dirt, right? When he talks about primitive accumulation, capitalism is born in force and violence. He actually says the rosy dawn of capitalism, right, is in colonialism, right? He's like, it's enslavement, the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas. He makes reference to this it's a very famous passage, actually. I will read it out. I think it'll be helpful just to read this section of Marx. Just give me one moment. I had it pulled up. Or actually, you know what? I'll just read it. So 1 second. Okay, so Marx, in this chapter on the genesis of the industrial capitalist, he argues that the colonialism, he suggests colonialism is the clear foundation of capitalism, that primitive accumulation of capital really emerges first in the colonies, not just in the enclosures in Western Europe, right? So he writes that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. On their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations with the globe for a theater. It begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes giant dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin War, and is still going on in the Opium Wars against China. So again, if we read this section of Marx, which I think Western Marxism systematically ignores, what we find is colonization and enslavement of non-Europeans are positioned here by Marx as the enabling conditions for the emergence and subsequent unfolding of capitalism as a mode of production. So he's suggesting this is a primary kind of foundation rather than something secondary. So primitive accumulation, if we read this, it must be reconsidered as a world scale process involving both the enclosures in Europe that generate that capital working class relation that we just discussed, and the colonization of non-European worlds by Europe. Now, for our concerns here, the key question that Marx's broader account of primitive accumulation provokes is the following. If the register of primitive accumulation in Western Europe gives rise to the distinctive qualitative relation of capital labor, what are the distinctive qualitative relations which emerge from primitive accumulation in the colonies? And how do these bear upon the emergence and reproduction of capitalism? Now, it is in setting out to answer this question that we do, however, reach a limit in terms of the content of Marx's account of the relations between colonialism and capitalism. Specifically, there's a gap between Marx's empirical observation noted above that colonialism underpins capitalism and the analytical and theoretical categories that he devises to apprehend the capitalist mode of production. There are no, in other words, distinctive qualitative relations which emerge for Marx through the colonial register of primitive accumulation. The latter appears to only provision a quantum stock of capital in contrast with the European register of primitive accumulation, which is given exclusive analytical and theoretical significance by Marx in terms of the emergence of the core qualitative relation, capital labor, structuring capitalism. Okay, so it is here that third world Marxism intervenes by deploying the Marxist method to overcome what may be the Eurocentric limits of the content of Marx's account of the transition to capitalism. Right? It is thus that, Samir Amin argues that to be a Marxist is to continue the work that Marx began. He says that though Marx did not account for the role of the underdevelopment of Asian and African societies in the formation of capitalism as a world system, this doesn't necessitate abandoning Marx, but counting him outdated, but rather simply that he had not finished what now third world Marxism can set out to complete, which is integrating the global developments, the global dimensions of capitalism into his analysis. Now, so people like the Patnaiks, Walter Rodney, Amin, they have sought to work on how we can think about what concepts and categories are generated through the colonial register of primitive accumulation. Now, some examples of these are for Amin. He thinks about the category of global value or core periphery, underdevelopment. The Patnaiks talk about exogenous stimuli. So what I think I would emphasize here, though, is like when we think about those empirical examples that Marx talks about, right? Like, so the conquest of the Americas, enslavement of African peoples. Is this just providing a quantity of capital, or what does it generate in terms of these qualitative relations? So if we have capital labor, what else exists in terms of the functioning of the capitalist system? And here's where I think we can think through, and this is, I think, the piece by M. N. Roy, is that, so Samir Amin, I think Roy, even Che, what they're suggesting is that there's a way in which that contradiction that we talked about, right, between capital and labor, it is stabilized, right, by an imperialist foundation. It is not a secondary moment. It only could ever emerge because from the 16th century onwards, this primitive accumulation in the colonies provisions raw materials, it provisions a transfer of wealth from periphery to core that generates, like, say, super profits, but it generates a level of surplus because it doesn't have to account for the reproductive capacity of the peoples in the peripheries, right? You can simply appropriate and take from the colonies without having to think about reproducing those societies in the way you need to reproduce the working class in the core, right? So now this then generates this question of, from the conquest of the Americas onwards, that there is I think this is where it's very key, the core periphery relation that emerges. So there's capital labor, there's core periphery that is structured upon the denial of sovereignty to peoples in the colonies, right? The absolute denial of sovereignty to people in the colonies through force through violence is the means through which you can transfer whether foodstuffs or industrial inputs to the core that can repress costs, right, in terms of reproducing the laboring class, in terms of industrial costs, in such a way that can allow for wages to be repressed and profits to be realized, because now the cost of living for the working class has been reduced, right, through this transfer of surplus from the colony to the core, right? So just to be kind of maybe brief about it is that this, I think this the key point to keep in mind here is though it's if we want to think about a qualitative relation, if you have capital labor, on a world scale, maybe the qualitative relation here is the denial of sovereignty to colonized peoples, right? That this denial of sovereignty through a logic of racialization and race is key to, I think, the structuring of the entire capitalist world system, right? So there is a way in which this introduces, I think, logics of genocide, of elimination into capitalism, right? Because the logic of colonialism, whether it's the early Spanish conquest of the Americas, the British conquest of India and elsewhere, there's a way in which, again, there's an appropriation of resources, of labor, in a more absolute sense, right? In which a sufficient amount of resources can be taken that again stabilize that relationship. I think that's just the point kind of wanted to make there around you have a register of primitive accumulation in the core and a different register of primitive accumulation in the colony that gives rise to different types of relations, right? A racialized denial of sovereignty to colonized peoples. I think that is the foundation in many ways of the capitalist world system. I think that's hopefully clear enough. Maybe doesn't need to be belabored anymore. Maybe one point to emphasize here, though, is that, well, what does this look like, right? So you have, for example, in the colony, you would have a dispossessed class. I think Roy talks about this, right? The way in India, you would have the transformation of India from a semi-industrial country or a somewhat a different type of cottage industrial country that is destroyed in the context of colonization and the reduction of India to an agricultural peasant-based society. And then the peasantry in India, this emergent peasantry, is kind of whether India or in the Americas with a different type of landlord class, they're ruled over by a logic of violence and force that enables the extraction of surplus from those peripheral zones into the colonial zone. How are we doing, Paul?
We're doing great. I want to put a very question on this theme. In particular, I'd like to discuss briefly, what the class character of National Liberation Project might be. Now, one of the assigned readings was this really interesting piece by Vladimir Lenin, which was written in 1913. So this was maybe early phases of the development of his theories on imperialism. This was before World War I, which, as we know, provided an impetus for the formation of the Third International, the Communist International, not least because that war absorbed much of the colonial world in it to fight on behalf of their oppressors. And in this piece called Backward Europe and Advanced Asia, Lenin looks at what he calls civilized and advanced Europe, in quotation marks, as really this a site of this engine of global reaction. He says that the bourgeoisie, the ruling class of Europe, becomes so powerful and so fearful of the growth and strength of its proletariat that it's prepared to support anything backward and reactionary, both within its borders and beyond them. And with these increasingly powerful movements that were emerging in Asia for democracy, but principally for sovereignty. And one point he makes is that in those parts of the world, in the colonized world, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist ruling class, was siding with the proletariat and other forces in those parts of the world. Because there was this additional contradiction introduced into the system by colonialism and imperialism. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how we understand the class character of of struggles for national liberation, and how that analysis might need to account for factors that maybe are less relevant in an analysis of a purely European or global North context?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and it's interesting though, Paul. Like, I think I have some. I think Roy's response to Lenin. I think that was also assigned here, right? The thesis on the um, the supplementary thesis on the national question and the colonial question, right? I think it complicates Lenin's original thesis. I think there's an interesting point there, because I think, yeah. You would have see the Bolsheviks and Lenin, they're thinking about the potential for an international proletarian revolution, right? But because of the way in which the exploitation of the working class is stabilized by the colonial register of primitive accumulation, right? It blunts the revolutionary potential of the working class in the core. I think that's something that becomes self-evident even after the October Revolution, that there isn't a spreading of proletarian revolutions across Europe, right? Because in many ways, the European working classes have access in some ways to a level of participating in markets due to this value drain from the peripheries to the core. So I think I think Lenin is correct here in saying that the liberation of oppressed nations will then generate the conditions to enhance the revolutionary consciousness of workers. Now, if the bourgeois class, these emergent classes that are kind of emerging within the colonial framework, in the peripheries, if they are looking for to ally with the proletariat and peasants in the colonies, Lenin is saying, well, this is the primary question. We need to support the reclamation of sovereignty, and then the class question can come kind of afterwards, right? I think this is the point that Lenin is also suggesting, to an extent, right? But I think Roy's response to Lenin, and then I think also Frantz Fanon's in Wretched of the Earth, he also, I think, further develops Roy's point, right? Is that actually a bourgeois leadership of the anti-colonial struggle will lead to neo-colonialism is an argument that I think Roy and Fanon are both trying to add to Lenin's thesis, right? Is that I think when you're talking about like the class question, the class character of national liberation, I think, and let me explain why that is that I think the way in which Roy and Fanon are talking about it is like the bourgeois or landlord classes in the colonies, right? They may seek to take leadership of the national struggle, but they may be motivated to be looking simply to enhance their space for accumulation, right? They may be feeling restrained or limited by the existing structure of imperialism, so they might be looking for more spaces for accumulation themselves. What Roy is suggesting in the piece that was assigned today is that actually the peasant masses, right, the interests of the peasantry need to be at the leadership of the liberation struggle, right? Like because the reclamation. I'm just gonna. I had something prepared on this, so I'm just gonna read this out. Just give me 1 second. I think this will help answer your question, Pavel. Is it okay if I read it out for like just 3-4 minutes? Yeah.
Of course.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so I think this is going to address this question, and this is something that I had prepared, and I think this can address it. So this is a section that I had titled for this lecture called "The Agrarian Question of National Liberation." In a way, this builds on, like I had mentioned at the outset, Moyo's point. What I'm trying to get at here is that the sovereignty question for the South and the peripheries, the reclamation of sovereignty, it does hinge on the class character of liberation, which will center the question of the peasant basis of national liberation. Okay, so the national question has long constituted a key concern of Marxist praxis and the international socialist movement more broadly. While it rose to prominence in the debates of the Third Socialist International as a means of clarifying the place of rising anti-colonial national liberation struggles in the movement for international socialism, the origins of the national question can be traced to Marx's reflection on the geopolitics of capitalism. Lenin, the foremost theorist of the national question during the Third International, grounded his position in an application of Marx's analysis of the Irish question to the national and colonial questions posed to African and Asian peoples denied sovereignty by European and American capitalist imperialism. What was of particular significance to Lenin was how Marx came to reverse his original formulation of the relation between proletarian revolution and national liberation, wherein he ultimately realized that the English working class would not come to attain revolutionary consciousness so long it was materially located as part of a national formation oppressing the subjugated Irish nation. Lenin returned to these insights in the course of a debate with Rosa Luxemburg over whether socialists should support Polish independence, and further developed them in his famous text Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, into a broader theoretical framework that emphasized that the national oppression of colonized peoples, in the political form of the denial of sovereignty, enabled the European bourgeoisie to stabilize the contradictions of capitalism, thus blunt the revolutionary consciousness of the working classes of the core European states. It was necessary, Lenin argued, to therefore prioritize the national liberation of colonized peoples in the international socialist movement, as doing so would call into question the colonial markets and surplus drain that stabilized capitalist accumulation in the core. This would likely require, Lenin further argued, the need for proletarian movements in the core to tactically support bourgeois-led national liberation movements in the periphery, as the latter were historically tasked with transitioning the colony from dependent to autonomous capitalist state, at which point a proletarian class could emerge to lead a further socialist revolution. The national question came to be most clearly linked to the agrarian question when both questions were taken up and advanced by revolutionary theorists engaged in anti-colonial struggles for national liberation. These are people like Fanon, Roy, who we read today. They complicated Lenin's thesis on the national and colonial questions by demonstrating that such questions could not be resolved by a bourgeois-led national liberation movement that would result in a bourgeois form of national sovereignty. Whereas Lenin had urged the international socialist movement to, where necessary, provisionally support bourgeois nationalist forces in their fight to overthrow colonialism, Fanon argued that such a form of, I think Fanon, Roy as well, who we read today, Roy and Fanon argued that such a form of national liberation could be nothing more than a false dawn that would inevitably lead to neo-colonial subjugation and the degeneration of nationalism into chauvinism and racism. The assumption that newly liberated nations could follow a European statist path of first bourgeois, then socialist revolutions was flawed on two grounds. The first is that European bourgeois social formations were only able to achieve historical progress through a colonial foundation that would not be available to bourgeois national development projects in the ex-colonies. Second, what bourgeois class that did exist in the colonized world had been structured not as an independent national class capable of directing autonomous national development, but rather as an intermediate dependent class that profited from the appropriation of surplus from the colony to the metropole. Such a class would, even after formal independence, not be capable of overturning the inherited colonial structure of the national economy. Rather, it would only go so far as claiming for itself, under the guise of nationalization, a greater share of the unfair advantages, which are a legacy of the colonial period. The national bourgeoisie, Roy and Fanon argue, would be quite content with the role of the Western bourgeoisie's business agent, and it will play its part with any complex in a most dignified manner. This point is, this is not to reject any place for the bourgeoisie, but it can't be the leading class, I think is the point that they're making. So Fanon and Roy, it is here that they grasp the convergence between a national and agrarian question. Neocolonialism and the degeneration of nationalism into chauvinism and racism could only be avoided and substantive liberation achieved by closing what Fanon calls closing the road to the national bourgeoisie and instead conducting anti-colonial national liberation struggle and securing sovereignty upon the upward surge of the wretched of the earth, those classes of the colony subjected to what we were talking about earlier is an absolute appropriation of their labor and resources. Now, Fanon and Roy are specifically talking about the peasantry, whether they're still working the land in the countryside or reconstituted as a landless class in the city. And these are, for Roy and Lenin alone, the revolutionary class, for they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. This is a quote from Fanon: "The starving peasant outside the class system is the first among the exploited to discover that only violence pays. For him, there is no compromise, no coming to terms. Colonization and decolonization are simply a question of relative strength," right? So this integral anti-colonial articulation arises through the peasant's structural location on the margins of the colonial economy, where through their outright dispossession or through colonial debt mechanisms, they are absolutely excluded from access to the surplus extracted from their traditional lands. Now, the intensive appropriation of the peasantry is enforced by this intermediate rural landed bourgeoisie. So from the point of view of the peasantry, and unlike the bourgeoisie, there can be no compromise, no coming to terms with the colonial structure, and an anti-colonial national liberation program organized around the interests of the peasantry censures the imperative of not only taking back land from the foreigner, but of such a point that taking back is a form that insists that land belongs to those that till it. Now we know that this form of anti-colonial revolution took its strongest expression originally in China, right? With I think the peasant basis of the Chinese Revolution. I think the point they're making though, Powell, is that like it is only in structuring, I think, a liberation struggle on the interests of the peasantry that you can structurally reorganize a post-colonial economy in such a way that can lead it to developing sovereign conditions of economic development, because it is through land reform and nationalization that you can overcome dependent economic conditions that are imposed through the legacy of colonization. Yeah, so I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, thanks for that. That's great. We're touching on themes that we'll be exploring in later parts of this chapter, but especially in chapter 2 on imperialism. But I wanted to say a couple of words about these structures of unequal exchange. I spent a bit of last week with Jason Hickel, who's been doing extensive research on this, and he put forward in a lecture a stunning figure, which is that today, in the last year in which he gathered data, his team gathered data, there was a drain of value from the south to the north of 12 billion tons of embodied materials, 21 exajoules of embodied energy. Now, what that means, he says, what that represents is enough materials and energy to provide decent living standards, which includes universal healthcare, universal education, modern housing, sanitation, electricity, cooling and heating, refrigerators and freezers and washing machines and public transit and computers and mobile phones for every single person in the global south, including Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And so, if we look at some of the implications of what you've been saying, and if we look especially at the formulations that Enroll put forward in his supplementary theses, because I think they're both powerful, clear, and continue to be relevant. He says, the super profits made in the colonies form one of the main sources of the resources of capitalism. And the European working class will only succeed in overthrowing the capitalist order once this source has finally been stopped up. And then, in fact, he says more strongly in the next paragraph, the loss of the colonies and the proletarian revolution in the other countries will bring the downfall of the capitalist order. So this touches on questions of the structure of solidarities between the North and the South, between political forces in the North and national liberation movements in the South. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that in the context of the internationalist tradition, and also in the context of the swelling of solidarity movements today when we look at the situation in Palestine and West Asia more broadly.
Yeah, so I think just a couple of points on that. I think so the question of like solidarity, I think so I think a key point here is one challenge that liberation movements have faced from the periphery is that like if we go back to the opening points of our discussion today, that the primitive accumulation in the peripheries in the colonized world is founded like on a genocidal logic of enclosure that imposes a level of force, right, through which colonized peoples then are forced to participate in the capitalist world system in such a way that they can be subject to what Mike Davis called late Victorian Holocaust, massive famines, massive forms of like denial of the even ability to reproduce their lives on a basic level. This is so core to the capitalist world system that when colonized peoples rise up and seek to reclaim sovereignty, right, and to especially try to do so through that peasant basis that Fanon and Roy are talking about, it does lead to an intense kind of counter-revolutionary, counter-insurgency from the core, right? And I think this will often confuse, let's say, this question of solidarity from people who are organizing in the core with the periphery, right? So like there's a choice that is given. I think, and Fanon is very explicit about this, right? That, okay, if you really want your sovereignty and independence, he says, well, you can take it and starve, right? And the point I'm just trying to make here is that, like, whether it was from the Haitian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, in each instance where a liberation project involved an attempt to restructure the inherited colonial economy on a different class basis that would center the interest of the peasantry to reclaim land. And just a brief word, just to return to that just very briefly, why is land reform so important to the question of national liberation from the periphery, right? Because at the moment of independence, right, the colonies are encountering after centuries or decades or a long period of time where wealth and value has been drained from periphery to core. So they're independent, but they have a deficit of capital, they have a deficit of technology. So there can be a reintroduction of dependency into the post-colonial state. To develop, they are dependent on capital and technology from the core, and then they can set the terms of that exchange with the peripheral countries. So how can you overcome this problem of dependency, right? This problem of the drain of wealth from periphery to core? Well, one mechanism or one means to do so is through land reform and land redistribution, right? Because what the Chinese experience has shown us in China is that the overthrowing of this intermediary landlord class that profited somewhat, right, from capitalist imperialism, it provisions a form of what Mao called labor accumulation, a form of economic development that can generate surpluses, right, through land reform, because now there's a form of, whether it's collective or small-scale agriculture, that generates surpluses that can be recycled locally into the construction of smaller industries that overcome this dependency problem. Nationalization is another means to do so. In each instance in which a liberation movement sought to address these structural questions, they are immediately subject to blockade and sanctions from the imperialist core, right? That if you actually move to restructure your economy onto a basis that could overcome dependency, whether it's Haiti after the revolution, whether it's China after its revolution, and a series of other countries, you are subject to a logic of sanctions, maybe even war, intervention, but under the guise that we are attacking authoritarian states, right? And this will often complicate, I think, the development of solidarity between core and periphery, right? And it's like the states whose sovereignty is recognized by the core are those that actually will not disrupt the land question, right? Like, let's suppose you contrast India with China, you contrast Zimbabwe with South Africa, right? You have these contrasting models of national development. One is recognized by the core states because it doesn't disturb the drain of wealth from periphery to core. Those that do so through land reform, through nationalization, they are subject to sanction and blockade, which will often confuse, I think, movements in the core as well, right? Because they're looking for some sort of, I think, a different type of movement in the peripheries. But I think the question of solidarity was posed, and just to say maybe one more word on this, a rule of the capitalist imperialist system has been when people from the peripheries rise up and they really challenge the structural foundations of the system, they really challenge the property question in terms of the the landlordism or the denial of property to peasants in the periphery, when they challenge the control over resources by Western capital through a project of nationalization, that is when they can be subject not just to sanctions, but to genocidal war, right? That's been the history of, I think, capitalist imperialism from the 16th century to today. It can accept the existence of people in the peripheries so long as they play by the rules set by capitalist imperialism, right? So long as they don't disturb these property questions, they don't disturb the question of sovereign control over resources. If they remain within a dependent state, they can be allowed to participate under the guise of being developing peoples within a capitalist world system. But it's that moment of challenge that can invite genocidal war upon peoples. And that is the question of solidarity, Pawel, that we face even today, right? Is that And this is the question that Che is posing to us, I think, in the reading, the message to the tricontinental. If it's, I think that really gets to this question of solidarity. So I just wanted to read out a passage from Che. I think it calls a lot on us on this question: is what is called on us in the core when from the periphery a challenge is made to imperialism that then invites imperialism to try to restore the violent foundations of primitive accumulation through sanctions or genocidal war. What is called upon us? I think Che very powerfully um, um, articulates this in this. Just one second. Just give me 1 minute to pull it up here. Okay, here it is. So he's talking about Vietnam. The Che's talking about the Vietnam War here, right? And we have to remember the significance of the liberation struggle in Vietnam, and it has a lot of really powerful parallels to what we're seeing in Gaza today. Okay, so like what is the significance of Vietnam? Is that Vietnam in Dien Bien Phu, this battle in 1954 that Fanon references, that Che references, has a massive significance for the liberation movement in the mid 20th century, where the Vietnamese demonstrate a capacity to return to imperialism a greater force, right? That can deny the ability of imperialism to exercise absolute sovereign power over the resources of the peoples of the periphery. Now, when the Vietnamese rise up and defeat the French in Dien Bien Phu, it leads the Americans to actually return to the founding rule of capitalist imperialism to say, okay, if you refuse and seek to overcome this founding structural condition, you can be subject to genocidal warfare. So he asked this question that we can think about in relation to Gaza today. There's a sad reality. This is Che in the message to the tricontinental. There's a sad reality. Vietnam, a nation representing the aspirations, the hopes of a whole world of forgotten peoples, is tragically alone. The nation must endure the furious attacks of US technology with practically no possibility of reprisals in the south and only some of defense in the north, but always alone. The solidarity of all progressive forces of the world towards the people of Vietnam today to is similar to the bitter irony of the plebeians coaxing on the gladiators in the Roman arena. It is not a matter of wishing success to the victim of aggression, but of sharing his fate. One must accompany him to his death or to victory. This is a question he's asking. There's actually, just one moment, there's actually even a more powerful quote he has. He's basically though arguing like I'm sorry, I should have had this ready, but it was just such a powerful, just give me one more moment. Okay. Uh, Paul, just give me 1 minute. This is actually a very important quote. Sorry. Okay, so he's talking about when the United States begins bombing Vietnam, why it begins doing so. This is after Vietnam has demonstrated the liberation forces in Vietnam have demonstrated a capacity um, to defeat imperialism, the French imperialists first in 1954. So Che writes, almost 2 years ago, the United States started bombing systematically the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in yet another attempt to overcome the belligerence of the South and impose from a position of strength a meeting at the conference table. So we can think about what's happening in Gaza today with what's happening in Vietnam at this point. They're trying to disarm the Vietnamese because the armed power of the Vietnamese is the power that is threatening the ability of imperialists to continue to exercise sovereign power over not just the resources of the Vietnamese, but to project that power through the region more broadly. At first, the bombardments were more or less isolated occurrences and were adorned with the mask of reprisals for alleged provocations from the north. Later on, as they increased in intensity and regularity, they became one gigantic attack carried out by the Air Force of the United States day after day for the purpose of destroying all vestiges of civilization in the northern zone of the country. So this is very familiar to what we're seeing in Gaza today, right? That because the liberation forces in Gaza have challenged the actual material basis of imperialist power, right? Because as we've seen, Al-Aqsa flood was a really powerful strike right at the heart of the question of containing colonized peoples, of containing the region to a condition of just begging for their rights, right? It's a way in which force is returned, which will introduce different terms of negotiation, different terms of coming to an understanding, right? So what in Vietnam, they were trying to return the Vietnamese through the language of Che. He's saying, we've never seen this type of destruction that we're seeing in Vietnam, right? We can say the same of Gaza today. What is the threat that Vietnam poses to the capitalist world system, right? That it has to be subject to such genocidal warfare is basically what the language that Che is saying. And he's saying that, well, what does it mean to be in solidarity with the Vietnamese, right? It means to follow them in, like the people in Yemen are following the people in Gaza to say, right? We are ready for death or victory alongside you. The unfortunate situation that exists in the core is that even till today, we have not seen a capability, a capacity, right, to meet the people in Gaza, where Che is saying we need to meet the people in Vietnam in the 1960s, right? This context of shared struggle, of shared sacrifice, and it goes back to this contradiction in this capitalist world system that Lenin is pointing to, right? Is that you have a way in which imperialism stabilizes conditions of life. Now, we can say conditions of life are increasingly unstable in the core, right? We can say that their contradictions are heightening, but the contradictions are heightening precisely because of resistance from the peripheries, right? Because increasingly the rise of China, the rise of sovereign development in the South has restrained the ability of the global North to drain wealth and resources from the periphery to the core, which impacts their ability to contain prices, to contain inflation, to continue to contain that contradiction between capital and labor in the core, right? But nonetheless, the case still remains that we have to ask ourselves, what has prevented, as we witness our state commit genocide in Gaza, the United States, why are proletarian forces, working class forces, disorganized or not, organized or not, have they not been able to meet the people of Gaza, where Che is saying we need to meet the people of Vietnam, right? And it's a looming question because the genocide proceeds in Gaza because the costs against it are not sufficiently high, right? This is essentially what it's coming down to. As Che is saying in Vietnam, are the Vietnamese alone? What does it mean to be in solidarity with the Vietnamese materially, right? We express solidarity with the people of Vietnam. We oppose the war, but are we willing to share that sense of sacrifice, that sense that the Vietnamese are willing to die for their freedom? What are we willing to do to stop the United States empire from bombarding the Vietnamese, right? That is, I think, the question, Powell, of solidarity that is not so easy to answer. We can theorize it and say, well, what does this mean for solidarity, right? But the reality continues to be that grounding contradiction of capitalism, that imperialism stabilizes capitalism in the core. It's not very stable in the core, but somehow, you can attend a protest, you can do whatever it is, but there is something that is still preventing a sense of urgency or organization to meet the people of Gaza on a plane of shared sacrifice.
That's a wonderful note, I think, on which we can conclude this lecture and this unit. We'll pick up on many of these themes, especially in chapter 2 on imperialism, looking not only at imperialism as an expression of capitalism on the world stage, but also at the various instruments of imperialist counter-revolution, which seek to disarm, dispossess, and destroy movements for liberation, movements that pose a challenge to structures of capitalist accumulation. Now, for the next unit, which for the lecture of which will be in 2 weeks, with once again Amar Ali Jan and Sarah J. Raimundo, will build on themes that we've explored today, which with the very important, I think, shift that emerged with the Third International, with M. Roy, and that was carried forward in many of the thinkers. You mentioned Bikrum, which is the shift in this axis of intellectual production of theoretical, political thought about revolution, about revolutionary capacity, about imperialism, and ultimately about solidarity and internationalism. And so we'll look at the ways in which the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movement became entangled with Marxism, and how that shaped that movement, and how Marxism was in turn reshaped by it. So that lecture will be in 2 weeks' time at the same time as today. Bikrum, thank you so much for making the time today.
Thanks, Paul.